When I was in the U.S. Army many decades ago, when I was quite a young man, I was stationed in Germany, specifically near a town called Furth, and I was on a pretty small base that was mostly us combat engineers, and there was a depot for truckers as well. And as I remember, there were some male people as well, handling the post office stuff for us soldiers. And so we weren't on a big base. It was mostly geared towards the 16th Engineer Battalion. And I was in one of the companies. We had a bunch of what were called line companies, meaning the engineers who would be doing the, whole bunch of different activities that combat engineers do. And I'll tell you about that in a bit. And then we also had another company, and I forget exactly what they were called, but they had like boats and bridge building equipment and these kind of tank-like things that were used for hauling and breaking things down. And in our company, we were mechanized, so we had M113 armored personnel carriers, and then we had a bunch of trucks as well. Many of them were like 5-ton dump trucks. We had some smaller ones, and then we had some trailers that got hauled by these M113s. And so each squad had its own armored personnel carrier and its trailer, and it was just filled with stuff. And the story that I'm going to tell you today is not so much about all of that. Maybe I'll talk about that in more detail some other time. And it's more about something that would happen every so often, mostly at random intervals, called going on alert. And so I got to give you a little bit of background. So we were not that far from the border with, at that time, Czechoslovakia. This is before the breakup of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And we were at the very end of the Cold War without realizing it. We were facing off against the Soviet Union and their allies, basically satellites, called Warsaw Pact, which included Poland and Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, right? All these countries that were supposed to be providing more troops, and the Soviets would be running through them and attacking us. And we were in a time when, in the 1970s, it was clear that the Soviet forces would just, it looked like they would just swamp the NATO forces. But by the late 80s, early 90s, we were looking a lot better. And while we were there, the Velvet Revolution started happening, the breakdown of the Warsaw Pact, and then not all that much longer after that, the Soviet Union itself would fall apart. But we didn't really know that at the time. So we were preparing to essentially fight World War III in Central Europe. And as combat engineers, we would be going out pretty much ahead of everybody else. Every single squad was delegated to a company of either infantry or armor, that's tanks. And if we were going to be, fighting, we would be doing things like blowing up minefields or putting minefields in places or creating obstacles or blowing up obstacles or just fighting as infantry. And, our life expectancy was very, very short. So there was all of that involved. And every once in a while, just for, readiness purpose, they would sound the alert and the word would go out to everybody. It usually took place around 3 o'clock in the middle of the night, early morning. And, people would come into your room in the barracks, if you were in the barracks, and they would wake you up and say, alert, alert, and you had to get all of your stuff. And I'll talk about that in a moment. If you were living off post, Well, you had to get to the post and, do the things that you needed to do as part of your unit. And if you were on guard duty, which was the case for me a couple times when we went on alert, well, then you would, somebody else would take your place on guard duty and you would go and take care of all of these things on your own. And so the things that we had to do was, there was a big motor pool. That's where all the vehicles were kept, right? And you knew that the armored personnel carriers were all going to be rolling out and going to the back gate, and you needed to meet your squad and indeed platoon and company in that mess there. But there were other things that had to happen first before you could do that. So you had to get all of your equipment, right? Your load-bearing equipment, your rucksack with your stuff. You'd go down to the armory and get your weapon. In my case, I carried an M16 with an M203 grenade launcher. And then the armory itself had to be basically taken from the armory, which is in the basement of our barracks. Everything had to be placed onto trucks, the entire armory, so that our whole unit could move out to wherever it was that we were going. So we were essentially leaving our barracks and packing everything up, either into our armored personnel carriers or into trucks or stuff like that. And so that's what had to happen. And along with that went certain other things. So our armored personnel carriers, and let me tell you about them a bit. So the M113s, those were from the Vietnam era, and they really were just armored personnel carriers made out of aluminum with walls about this thick, so they would stop, small arms fire, but probably not heavy machine gun fire. And so that would be kind of a problem. We were, not all that well armored. It's not like driving a tank or even a Bradley armored fighting vehicle, which the infantry was getting by that time. And so, we had these big boxy things that had tracks, and they were kind of fun to drive. I actually got to drive ours out in the field every once in a while. It was like driving a tank, right? And then it would have, our only real armament was a 50 caliber machine gun, and these were even older. These are like World War II stock. I think they're still probably using the same ones that we had. And so the commander, the squad leader, would be the person who'd be firing that up on top. And we'd also have to have like a tripod for it. And you had to have these barrels for it because it's firing, it's a heavy machine gun. It's firing a lot of pretty, substantial ammo out there. So the barrels could get hot. You'd have to swap them out. So from the armory, I would receive my weapon, and then I would get some other piece of the 50 caliber machine gun, because you didn't keep those out on the tracks. They were in the armory. So there were basically 4 pieces to it. There was the tripod, which was heavy as hell, 2 barrels, and then the actual mechanism itself. And each of us would, get issued one of these things. And you've already got like all of your gear on and, your weapon. And so you just like put it over your shoulders and then you would run. You would actually run down with all of this stuff. After you'd help them, load up the stuff, you'd run down to the motor pool and meet up with your squad and get in the armored personnel carrier. And then we would haul ass out to the back gate where we were supposed to deploy from. And a few times we actually did deploy. We actually drove to Grafenwehr for, field exercises. We were supposed to go out there anyway, but, the alert sent us out earlier that morning. Other times we would just get there and then, somebody would go down the line and check out if we had all of our stuff the way we're supposed to. We'd all be like half asleep and we're sitting in the armored personnel carrier. It's cold, the smell of diesel everywhere, right? Because everything's running on diesel. And you'd be like nodding off and they'd ask you questions and make sure that you actually had all the stuff that you were supposed to have. But we would have, as I mentioned, not just the big armored personnel carrier, which had all sorts of other crap on top of it, camo netting on the front and, all sorts of other things connected to it. But then there's this wagon, this trailer that is not quite as big as the armored personnel carrier, but it is just loaded with all of this crap. Stuff that you're, as a squad, responsible for. Actually, the captain is responsible for everything, as I found out when I worked for supply for a while, and some things were missing, and I had to be detailed to reconcile it, because combat engineers aren't that bright, and I was one of the few people who could actually keep ledgers of stuff. Anyway, that's a whole different story. And so, we'd had to have all this stuff, chainsaws and brush hooks and, tools for working on this and that, every kind of tool you could possibly imagine. We probably had one of them, and they're all in the trailer. So the trailer would be, hitched just like, driving a trailer or a boat or anything like that. There was like a bump, like a fifth wheel thing that it would sit on, and then it would go out there. And you had to be a little bit careful driving with the trailer, because it's one thing to have tracks, right? And then it's another thing to have wheels. So you couldn't go quite as fast with the trailer. And I remember one time, this is actually pretty cool, I got to the motor pool, and I think it's because I was on guard duty. So first we had to make the arrangements. Then I had to run from the guard post to our company barracks. Then I had to go down, go upstairs, get my stuff, get it on, get down to the armory, get my weapon, get my 50 caliber machine gun barrel. And then I, had to make my way down to the motor pool. And with all of these things, you would run. You would actually run with all of this gear in your boots and stuff like that. Because it's just what real life combat would be like. And so I get down there and I'm like, oh crap, where the hell's my squad? The armored personnel carrier is gone. As a matter of fact, my whole platoon is gone. They're all moved out to the back gate, and I'm like, oh man, this is going to be a pain to get, to the back gate. I just ran down here. I'm all sweaty. I'm out of breath, probably have at least 70 to 80 pounds of gear that I'm carrying and hoofing around. I'm like, it's over a mile from the motor pool to where I'm supposed to go. This sucks, right? And fortunately, I saw one of the other platoons. I was in second platoon, and it was either somebody in first platoon or third platoon, and their armored personnel carrier is pulling out, and the trailer's there, and they're hauling ass, and I'm like, well, I can make sure that I actually get where I'm supposed to be on time so I don't get myself in trouble and get my squad in trouble. And I ran with all of this gear on and jumped and grabbed onto the back of the armored personnel carrier and put my feet, I don't know what I was standing on exactly, probably some sort of rung, and I'm just riding it. Nobody knows that I'm on there, because if they saw me, I would have gotten in trouble. This is a clear safety violation, not least because you got that trailer, and as you're going around the curve, the trailer is veering in, and you got to get real close so you don't get smushed by the trailer as this thing is taken off, And so I rode it all the way, and it's dark, right? So nobody actually knows what's going on. There's lights, of course, but they're all kind of random, going off in different directions. And so I'm riding this thing, and I go all the way to where they're stopping, and my squad is ahead, right? Because my squad got out quicker than they did. So as they start slowing down, I jump off, and then I start walking. And actually somebody saw me, some sergeant, and he's like, looking at me, and he's like, you shouldn't be doing that. And I was like, well, I got to get down here for my squad. And he's like, fine, right? So I hurry up and get to my squad, and I get to the back and open up the hatch. And they're like, where the hell were you? And I was like, well, guard duty, man. I got to get all this stuff in gear. Here's the 50 cal barrel, right? And they're like, okay, great. Now we're all squared away and we're done. So that was a kind of a funny experience that I had, getting away with something you weren't supposed to do. But, if it was wartime, nobody would be looking at us and saying, oh, safety violation or anything like that. And the thing is, too, whenever we had these alerts, if you were a regular soldier, and that would be something if you were like in one of the higher up things in headquarters or something. But if you're a regular soldier like me and the rest of us, we didn't know whether we were actually going off to war or whether it was just another drill, because we were constantly training to go and, move out and fight the Soviets and Warsaw Pact as they flooded across the border. And we were supposed to be the stopgap to hold them long enough, or slow them down at least, so that reinforcements could come in from the other NATO forces. And hopefully we wouldn't be dead by then, but odds are we would be. So anyway, I was thinking about that the other day, specifically about the jumping on the back of the 113 and riding out, but also about the whole mindset of military readiness when you've got a clear enemy across the border who, is probably doing the same sort of thing, just as worried about having to fight you as you are them. But you're young and, full of bravado and pretty unrealistic about warfare anyway. So it's all kind of an adventure at the same time. And I think for the older guys, the sergeants, and the other officers, I mean, sergeants are non-commissioned officers, but I mean commissioned officers, they probably didn't look at it the same way. Or the guys who were a bit older and had wives and kids who were not necessarily NCOs, they probably looked at it quite differently. But we thought of it as like, this is a great break in the routine of otherwise doing preventive maintenance and whatever exercises we have to do, put up a minefield, take it down, cleaning the place constantly and all of that. So one of the stories about my military service, maybe you find it interesting. You can't generalize from this to anything about today's military. We're several generations removed from it. The U.S. Army is a whole different animal than it was around 89 and 90 compared to what it's like today, or even when we were in Gulf War II and Afghanistan. It's quite a different way of preparation and fighting, but that's the way things were back then, when we were just at the end, without realizing it, of the Cold War.